The most terrible thing is not becoming helpless. The most terrible thing is turning away from someone who once held you in their arms. Unknown author. First, he turned away from his father. Then, fate turned away from him. Father. His name was George Miller. Picture a man standing firmly on the ground, the kind whose hands smelled of machine oil and dependability. He came from a small town where life flowed steadily, where the air was cleaner and people were closer to each other. A town where every car horn was a greeting, not a curse. Where men like him built things with their hands, not mouse clicks. George Miller was exactly that kind of man. A mechanic by trade, gifted by God. Hands of gold, character, straightforward as a steel rod. Fix a leaky faucet, easy. Rebuild an engine, you got it. Calm down the neighbor whose cat ran off again, he could do that too. It seemed he could fix anything, except the cracks in his own life. His wife left early, not for another man, no. She just left, as if she'd burned out from the inside. I'm tired, she'd thrown out quietly, almost guiltily. And she left him, with their 5-year-old son, Mark. A man will raise a man, she said at parting, and there was more despair than faith in those words. Her silhouette dissolved on the train platform, and then, in memory, leaving behind only the faint scent of perfume in the empty apartment and a gnawing sense of loss. George was left alone. Alone with a 5-year-old boy full of questions and a 2-bedroom apartment where every corner, every curtain, seemed to still hold her laughter, her steps, her presence. The past clung to him, but there was no future with her. And so, he began to live. Not just exist, live for two. He worked at the plant, took side jobs in the evenings. Instead of resting after his shift, he assembled intricate building sets with Mark, read tales of knights and dragons, though his eyes were heavy with fatigue. He often fell asleep faster than his son, his nose buried in the page. He walked Mark to kindergarten, holding the boy's small hand in his own large, calloused one. He learned to cook oatmeal without lumps. In winter, he built snow forts and slides in the yard, and they'd slide down together, laughing until tears streamed down their faces. No complaints, no reproaches against fate. He just lived. Because Mark was his anchor, his meaning, all that remained of that other life, and everything worth fighting for in this one. Mark grew up, a quiet, obedient boy with a serious, wise beyond his years gaze. He idolized his father, always nearby, always with questions. "Dad, are you the strongest man in the world?" George would smile, ruffling his hair. "You bet, I'm your Terminator, stronger than anyone." "And when you get really, really old, really weak?" His father would gaze somewhere into the distance, a shadow of sadness flickering in his eyes. "Then you'll be strong for me, son. You'll be my strength." They promised each other many things in those days, sometimes aloud to the nighttime murmur of crickets outside the window, sometimes silently, just with glances. They promised to be there, to support each other, not to betray. But time passed, and the first warning bells rang unnoticed. Adolescence hit Mark like a bolt of lightning. Music blared deafeningly from his headphones, walling him off from the world, from his father. Conversations became shorter, sharper. Fatherly advice, once so important, now only provoked and irritated. "Dad, just leave me alone, okay?" Mark's gaze changed, evasive, empty. He looked right through his father, never lingering, never seeing. George felt a pang of pain in his heart, but tried not to show it. He'll outgrow it, he reassured himself. Difficult age, his own interests. He'll understand later. He definitely will. He'll come back. He waited. Patiently. believed in their unspoken promises, in the unbreakable bond that had existed between them from the very beginning. But Mark didn't come back. After a stint in the service, he left to study in the big city. Noisy, alien, full of temptations and opportunities. And the city swallowed him whole. College, then work, new friends, a girlfriend. Life spun at a frantic pace, and in this new life, there seemed to be no room for his old father. Calls became less frequent. At first, once a week. Then, only on holidays, short, formal greetings. And then the phone remained silent for months. The silence became normal. George waited, never imposing, never reproaching. He marked his son's birthdays alone, bought him gifts every year like a ritual. A book Mark had wanted as a child, a warm sweater. Winters in that big city were cold. A watch, so his son would value time. He carefully packed these undelivered gifts into a large cardboard box in the closet. "It's okay. I'll give them to him when I see him," he whispered to himself, sealing the box with tape. What if he calls tomorrow? What if he remembers? And then, something no one expected happened. Something that turned his already difficult life upside down. A senseless accident at work. An old, rickety ladder. A moment of falling, impact, darkness. And then, the hospital, white ceilings, and the doctor's verdict, delivered like a gunshot. Compression fracture of the spine, paralysis, below the waist, permanent. A wheelchair became his new world. Hospital, agonizing rehabilitation, despair thick as tar. Pain, not just physical, but emotional, tearing him apart. The humiliation of helplessness. He didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't have hysterics. Only once, looking out the gray hospital window at the indifferent rain, he whispered quietly, almost silently into the void, "Mark, son, I don't think I can handle this alone." He called, only a week after being discharged, when he returned to his empty apartment, now his prison. His hands trembled so much he could barely press the buttons on his old phone. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat. He somehow knew this call was a step into the abyss. "Mark, hi." His voice was hoarse, unfamiliar. "Son, I need your help. I can't walk now. At all. Can't manage alone. Understand?" Silence hung on the other end of the line. Long, cold, ringing. Then came Mark's voice. Quiet, distant, icy. "Dad, listen, I've got work, projects, my own life. I'm not a caretaker, not an orderly. Besides, you always managed everything yourself. You were strong, so now, just manage somehow." George swallowed a thick lump. "Mark, this is serious, permanent. I'm not asking for much. Just..." "I can't, Dad. Understand. And, honestly, I don't want to. Sorry, don't come here. And, it's better if you don't call anymore, okay?" Short, merciless dial tones. They cut his ears, his heart, his soul. George slowly placed the receiver back on the hook. His hand fell limply onto his lap. He sat motionless for a long time, staring at a single spot on the shabby wall. Tears welled up, the first in many years. But he wiped them away. He couldn't. He didn't call again, ever. And he learned to live alone, anew, slowly, painfully, through clenched teeth, through physical pain, through the humiliation of his own helplessness, through the invisible walls of alienation that proved higher and stronger than prison walls. He dressed himself, overcoming awkwardness and shame. He learned to cook the simplest food, reaching the kitchen by pulling himself along, grabbing onto furniture. He fell. He crawled. He got up. He fell again, and got up again. He lived. simply because he didn't die, because stubbornness and the habit of fighting were in his blood. His son disappeared, dissolved into his successful, as it seemed to him, life, as if he had never existed. And George finally understood. He was alone, completely alone. Not because he had no relatives left, but because his only close relative had voluntarily erased him from his life, turned away. He didn't complain, didn't ask neighbors for help, though he saw their pitying, sometimes even disgusted glances. Only once a year, on Mark's birthday, he took that cardboard box with the undelivered gifts out of the closet, opened it, handled the items, looked at them silently, and then carefully sealed it with tape again. "Apparently, I didn't deserve your attention, son," he whispered bitterly into the emptiness of the apartment. Didn't deserve it. He didn't know then, couldn't even imagine, that fate, that ironic lady, was already preparing the same bitter cup for his son. And drinking it, he would remember everything. Winter arrived unexpectedly early and fierce that year. Snow fell for weeks, blanketing the city in a dense white shroud. It lay on rooftops, sidewalks, icy tree branches, and on the shoulders of a lonely, hunched man in a wheelchair by the window. George sat looking out at the street. The power had been off in his apartment for 3 days, shut off for non-payment. Penny by penny, but still not enough. The central heating radiators were barely warm, more dead than alive. A piercing cold filled the room. His fingers wouldn't obey, growing numb. He breathed on his hands, trying to warm them, and stared intently at an old, yellowed photograph on the table. There he was with Mark, just a little boy, laughing in front of a Christmas tree. Neighbors rarely came by now. At first, some kind-hearted old ladies would pop in, bring bread from the store, a bottle of water, ask if he needed anything. But over time, everyone got used to his existence behind the wall. He became part of the landscape, like the old creaking poplar tree in the yard. Just the old man on wheels. Who wants to bother with someone else's troubles? Everyone has their own worries. He wasn't angry, wasn't offended, and certainly didn't ask for anything. He just lived, or rather, survived. The phone was silent. The social worker formerly assigned to him was unavailable. Day off. Or maybe just didn't want to pick up. His disability check had arrived on his card, but he couldn't get to the only ATM in their neighborhood. Snowdrifts, uncleared sidewalks, high curbs, insurmountable obstacles, not a penny in the house. The bread ran out yesterday. Only buckwheat remained. He cooked it in water, without salt, without butter. Getting to the toilet now required crawling, lowering himself from the chair onto the icy floor, pulling himself along on his hands, like a wounded soldier under fire. Every foot, an ordeal. Then, the same way back, on his knees, rubbing the skin raw. Once, returning, he fell. Didn't have the strength to get up. He just lay on the floor, staring at the dusty ceiling, listening to the deafening silence of the apartment. He lay like that for 2 hours until, gathering the last remnants of his will, he managed to pull himself up and back into the chair. "So what did you achieve with your pride, George?" he whispered with parched lips. "Where is it now, your pride? Who needs it?" He didn't cry, just clenched his teeth so hard his temples throbbed. Like back then, years ago, when his wife left. Like when he was turned down for another job after being laid off. Like that day his son snapped into the phone. "I'm not your orderly." He tried contacting volunteers, online, through some support services, using the internet a neighbor sometimes helped pay for. The response came quickly, but was dry and soulless, like official paperwork. "Sorry, we have a waiting list. You are not currently a priority. There are more urgent cases, young people, single mothers with children. They are more important. please wait. He silently nodded at the blank computer screen. Okay, I'll wait. What's the rush now? But inside, something finally broke, froze, turned to ice. One day, completely unexpectedly, a patrolman stopped by. A young guy, embarrassed and awkward. "Just checking on living conditions, Mr. Miller," he said, trying not to look at the squalid surroundings. "Listen, maybe you'd be better off in a home for the elderly and disabled. You know, constant care, meals, help." George looked at him with tired but firm eyes. "No, son, thank you. I don't need a home. I definitely wouldn't get out of there. But here, this is my home, even like this, even if nobody needs me in it." "Do you have a son, relatives?" The officer clearly wanted to end this visit quickly. George gave a wry smile. "Had a son, once." "And where is he now? Maybe we can contact him." "He's where he's comfortable and happy," George replied, turning back to the window. "Far from here, very far." From then on, he lived by the strict rhythm of survival. Wake up, agonizing dressing, buckwheat cooked in water, water from the tap, silence, glance at the photograph, reading an old newspaper, read until it was falling apart, silence again, sleep. And every evening, before drifting into uneasy sleep, the same thought, the same silent plea. "Mark, son, just appear in my dream. Please." He didn't dream. But one night, he was awakened by noise in the hallway. Loud, drunken voices, some thudding, scuffling, someone cursing desperately, then the sound of a fall and a groan. George flinched. His heart beat faster. He carefully rolled his chair to the door, listening. And suddenly, his blood ran cold. One of the voices. It was painfully, shiveringly familiar. A voice he hadn't heard in many years, but one impossible to forget. Mark, his son. George froze by the door, holding his breath. Anxiety washed over him like an icy wave. He didn't know what was happening out there, beyond the door, but he felt it in his gut. Something happened. Something terrible. Mark had always lived life in the fast lane, learned quickly, built his career quickly, climbed the corporate ladder quickly, and just as quickly tried to forget everything that hindered this rapid ascent, everything that caused inconvenience, guilt, or required emotional effort. His father. His father became one such inconvenience, a heavy, silent reproach from the past. Sometimes, in rare moments of quiet, Mark tried to justify himself to his own conscience. "Well, what could I have done? My career was taking off, responsibilities, projects. I just couldn't drop everything and go be his caretaker. He's strong. He'll manage." But somewhere deep down, he knew. It was a lie. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He just didn't want to. Didn't want to see his father's helplessness. Didn't want to burden himself with cares. Didn't want to shatter the illusion of his successful, perfect life. And he continued to pretend everything was fine. At work, a brilliant project manager, expensive suit, trendy tie, coffee to go in hand, smartphone calendar perpetually packed, success, recognition, money, and in his soul, a gaping void. The girlfriend he'd lived with for several years left, unable to stand his emotional coldness and constant busyness. No real friends remained, only colleagues and buddies for Friday night bar hops, just as lonely and lost behind their facades of success. And then came the breakdown. First, at work. A tight deadline, immense responsibility, sleepless nights, mounting pressure from all sides. Then, a fatal mistake on an important project. Management's fury, the threat of termination. Stress reached a critical point, and his body gave out. A stroke, right in the middle of an important meeting. He just slid off his chair, unable to utter a word. He was only 34 years old. He woke up in a hospital room. White walls, the smell of medicine, the quiet beep of equipment. Speaking was difficult. Words wouldn't obey. His left arm hung limply like a whip. His leg felt foreign, wooden. Extensive damage to the left side, the doctor said calmly, but without a hint of optimism. The prognosis is cautious for now. It will require lengthy rehabilitation, your patience, and, of course, constant care. Doctor, tell me honestly, will I be able to walk? To work? Mark rasped. The doctor sighed. Maybe, in time, or maybe not. It depends on many factors, and on you too. The first person he thought of calling was his father. The image of George, helpless, lonely, suddenly appeared before his eyes with unbearable clarity. But he didn't have the nerve. Shame burned inside him more intensely than the effects of the stroke. He started calling others, old acquaintances, his ex-girlfriend, the neighbor down the hall, work colleagues. The responses varied, but the essence was the same. Hang in there, man. Sorry to hear that, buddy, but you know, I've got family, work. I'll help where I can, but constantly, no way. Some simply didn't pick up when they saw his number. The world he had so carefully constructed collapsed overnight. He was alone. He lay on the hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling, an IV in his vein, with a single, deafening thought. Who needs me now? Like this. Broken. Helpless. The month in the hospital flew by in a haze. Then they discharged him. Home. Or rather, to a rented ground-floor apartment that sympathetic colleagues helped find and pay for a couple of months. After that, on his own. Figure it out. His mother. He didn't even know where she was now. They'd lost touch long ago. His father, disabled, the one he himself had turned away from. He didn't call his father. Pride, mixed with panic and all-consuming shame, wouldn't allow it. And then things got worse, much worse. It turned out he couldn't do the simplest things. Couldn't walk to the pharmacy for medicine. Couldn't cook for himself. His left hand was completely useless. Couldn't even wash or dress himself properly. One day, he lay for almost 24 hours without food or water because he couldn't get out of bed. On the second day, his strength completely abandoned him. On the third, he tried to reach the bathroom and fell. He lay on the cold tile floor, unable to get up, only weakly tapping the tiles with his good hand. "Help! Someone!" he whispered with parched lips. But no one came. The apartment was submerged in silence, thick, viscous, hostile. And then panic engulfed him, a primal, animal fear of loneliness, thirst, pain, powerlessness, humiliation. He no longer raged against fate. He wept, for the first time in many, many years. Wept uncontrollably, like a frightened, abandoned child. And in his mind, through the haze of tears and despair, only one name surfaced. One word. Dad. He found his phone. An old, basic one. His smartphone had shattered in the fall. He dialed the number slowly, agonizingly. Unruly fingers trembled, slipped, mixed up the digits. The phone fell to the floor several times. Finally, he succeeded. The rings began. Long, drawn out, like eternity. 1, 2, 3. He had already lost hope. "Hello?" came a quiet, weak, but oh so familiar voice through the receiver. His father's voice. Mark froze, unable to utter a word. "Dad," he finally forced out. Silence on the other end. A second. 2, 3. It's me, Mark. I know, son. Recognized your voice. His father's voice was calm, without a trace of surprise or resentment. Mark's voice broke with emotion and rising tears. I'm really bad, Dad. I'm all alone. Can't cope. Another pause, heavy, filled with the unsaid. And then his father spoke. Quietly, simply, without the slightest reproach, without malice, without triumph. Son, you once said, you had no use for a disabled man, that you weren't my orderly. I'm sorry, Mark choked out, suffocating with shame. Forgive me, Dad. I was such a fool, such a bastard. Where are you now? His father asked just as calmly. Alone, home, in a rented apartment. I can barely walk. No one helps. I don't know what to do. Dad. Give me the address. Mark dictated the address, stumbling. Maple Avenue, apartment 3. Wait for me, I'll be there soon. Mark lowered the phone and wept again. But these were different tears, not of despair, but from a suddenly surging, almost forgotten feeling. He was a son again, someone's son, needed. George took a long time getting ready, a very long time. Not because he doubted for a moment. No, the decision came instantly the moment he heard his son's voice, full of pain and despair. But because every movement required immense effort, getting dressed, fumbling with buttons with uncooperative fingers, reaching the bag on the shelf, packing the essentials, leftover medicine, bandages, clean underwear, all the money saved from his disability checks for a rainy day, transferring to the chair, opening the heavy front door, all alone, overcoming pain and weakness. He called a paratransit service. The driver, a grim middle-aged man, silently helped him down the ramp and loaded the chair into the van. They drove in silence. George watched the snow-covered streets drift past the window, thinking only one thing: get there in time, get to his son, the same son who had once told him, I don't need you. The driver helped him up the 3 icy steps at Mark's building entrance. From there, on his own. The wheels of his chair bogged down in the slushy snow. His hands slipped on the cold rims. Each turn of the wheels echoed with a dull ache, less in his body than in his heart. Here was the right door. Apartment number 3. Ordinary, covered in cheap vinyl. He knocked, quietly but persistently. No one answered for a long time. It was quiet behind the door. Then came a faint rustle, uncertain steps, the click of a lock. The door slowly creaked open. Mark stood on the threshold. He had changed drastically. His shirt was wrinkled, unclean. His face, pale, gaunt, with an unhealthy grayness. Dark circles lay under his eyes. His left arm hung limply at his side. His left leg dragged noticeably. He leaned heavily on the doorframe with his good arm, as if on a crutch. Their eyes met. "Dad," Mark whispered, lips barely moving. "Hello, son," George replied calmly, evenly, as if the terrible years of silence and the abyss between them had never existed. "Letting me in?" Mark nodded silently and moved aside with difficulty, clearing the way. The door remained open. George wheeled himself into the apartment, looked around. Hallway, then the room. Bare walls, minimal furniture. An empty table held a single dirty cup. In the corner lay an open first aid kit, next to it, a trash can overflowing with empty medicine packaging and instant meal wrappers. The air hung heavy, stale, a mix of medicine, sickness, and old shame. "Sit down, why are you standing?" George said, nodding towards an old couch. Mark slowly, with visible effort, sank onto the edge of the couch. "How are you?" George asked, wheeling closer. "Not great, Dad," Mark answered quietly, not looking up. "Doctors say I need constant care, exercises, massage. Recovery will be long, and I can barely pour myself tea. Everything falls out of my hands." He lifted his head and looked at his father. For the first time in many years, truly looked, right into his eyes, saw his gray hair, wrinkles, the weariness in his eyes, saw the wheelchair, and suddenly his shoulders began to shake. He covered his face with his hands and wept, bitterly, inconsolably, like a child. "Forgive me, Dad. Do you hear? Forgive me. I was such a bastard, such an egoist. I got scared back then, of your illness, of my responsibility. Turned my back on you when you asked for help. And I just chickened out, Dad. Was just a plain coward." George was silent. He looked at his weeping son, and in his heart there was no anger, no resentment, only a dull ache and infinite pity. He slowly wheeled closer and placed his calloused hand on Mark's shoulder. "You were a son, Mark. You just forgot for a time what that means. But now, you remembered. And that's the main thing." Mark lifted his tear-stained face. "But why did you come? After everything I did? After those words?" George looked at him with his direct, tired but steady gaze. "Because you are my son. Always were and always will be. And also because, when family calls for help, you have to go. You absolutely must. Even if they once slammed the door in your face." From that day on, everything changed. George stayed in that uncomfortable rented apartment. He sat beside Mark, gave him medicine on schedule, cooked simple but hot meals in the tiny kitchen, moving with difficulty but persistently, showed him how to breathe properly when waves of pain or despair washed over him, taught him how to do simple things again with his paralyzed hand. And every day, over and over, he repeated the same words, like a mantra. "You'll get back on your feet, son. You definitely will. I'll help you. Just take your time. Don't give up. The main thing is, don't give up. Hear me?" They were together again, father and son. Not perfect, scarred, both physically and emotionally, but alive. And now, no longer alone. 3 months passed, 3 long months of persistent struggle, and Mark began to stand. At first, for a few agonizing seconds, holding on to his father's hand and the wall. Then, for a minute. Then, he managed to take the first uncertain step. George held his elbow firmly with his good arm, just as firmly as he had held his tiny hand 30 years ago, teaching him his first steps in the yard of their old house, among dusty sandboxes and creaky swings. "Place your foot straighter," he said in his usual, slightly hoarse voice. "Don't be afraid to fall. I'm here. I've got you." Mark didn't answer, just clenched his teeth until it hurt and took the next step. Another one, and another. He moved forward, not for physical therapy, for atonement. One morning, Mark woke up before his father. He quietly got up, shuffled to the kitchen, cooked buckwheat porridge himself, almost like his father's, just slightly burnt. Heated the kettle, set the table, placed 2 plates, 2 cups. George wheeled into the kitchen and froze at the doorway, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "What's this news? Did you decide to become a chef?" Mark smiled sheepishly, the first truly genuine smile in a long time. "Nah, Dad. Just wanted to be a little useful to you. While you're alive." George looked intently at his son, Moisture glistened in his eyes. "And what, did you think I was already dead?" he asked with a slight chuckle, but his voice trembled. "No, Dad. I thought you were alive, but without me anymore. That you didn't need me. At all." "Then you were mistaken, son. Mistaken." They ate in silence, for a long time, without rushing, savoring not so much the porridge as this new, fragile quiet between them. That special kind of silence exists only between those who have managed to truly forgive, and between those who have been forgiven. On the wall in the living room, above Mark's couch, a small homemade shelf appeared. On it, George arranged several old photographs from that very box. Here he is, young, holding little Mark in his arms. Here they are together at Mark's high school graduation. Here's an old worn postcard with a clumsy child's drawing and the inscription in awkward letters. "Dad, you're the strongest. Don't let me down." Mark picked up the postcard, turned it over. "You gave this to me once, right? For some holiday. I don't think I understood what it meant back then." "You were just little then," George answered quietly. "But now, you understand." George started going outside again, in his wheelchair, but no longer hunched over with hopelessness, but with a straight back, confidently maneuvering the wheels, and beside him walked Mark, already without a cane, slowly, limping slightly, but walking on his own, wearing a warm jacket, a small backpack slung over his shoulder, containing both his medication and his father's old hat in case of wind. The neighbors, the old ladies on the bench by the entrance, watched them with unconcealed surprise and curiosity. "George, is that your son? Came back, did he? And we thought, people were saying all sorts of things, that he'd abandoned you." George only smiled good-naturedly in response. Let bygones be bygones. Mark met his father's gaze and finished with a smile. "Or you'll get a flat tire." And they both chuckled quietly. They were very different, wounded by fate and their own mistakes, but now they were together, and because of that, they both felt whole. For the first time in many years, Mark felt, for the first time, not just like a son, but like a man, a person capable of action, of caring. And George, not just a helpless disabled man, but a father, a support. Even sitting in his chair, he seemed stronger and more dependable than many who stood firmly on 2 feet. One late evening, when his father was already asleep in the next room, Mark sat by the window, looking out at the sleeping city. He took a sheet of paper and a pen, and began to write a letter. A real paper letter, the first in his life. "Dad, forgive me for doing this by letter. Saying it aloud is still difficult for me. You saved me. Twice. When I was very little, you literally got me back on my feet after Mom left. You were everything to me. Father, mother, friend. And now, when I became an adult and almost died from my own stupidity and loneliness, you picked me up again. Only this time, you lifted my soul, pulled me out of the pit I dug for myself. Forgive me for everything, Dad. For my callousness, for my selfishness, for those terrible words on the phone, for all the years of your loneliness caused by me, and thank you. Just thank you for being here, as you are. My father." He carefully folded the paper into quarters, quietly entered his father's room, and placed the letter on his pillow next to his head. And in the morning, as usual, he got up early, cooked porridge, and placed 2 cups of hot tea on the table. Now in this house, in this rented apartment, there was no I and you. Now there was we. Spring arrived in the city somehow unnoticed, yet persistently. First, a timid dripping from the roofs. Then, the first shy grass sprouted in the thawed patches near the entrance, And one day, the first sleepy fly of the year brazenly flew into the slightly open kitchen window and buzzed over the table. George followed it with his eyes and sighed with a smile. Well, here we go. Mark, who was just trying to peel potatoes with one hand, laughed. What, Dad? Spring started? No, son. Life started. A new one. And spring. That's just a good reason for it. On weekends, they now always went out into the yard together. George, in his chair, Mark, beside him, barely limping anymore. They just sat on the bench or slowly strolled along the nearby park alley. The old lady neighbors now nodded welcomingly at them. You raised a good son, George. Caring. The father just smiled warmly in return. Yes, thank God he came back, came home. Mark met his father's gaze. There was no longer fear or shame in his eyes, only deep respect and love. The kind of real love that doesn't shout about itself from the rooftops and doesn't demand grand words. The kind that simply is. In the evening, they sat again in the small kitchen. A typical dinner, potatoes with canned stew, simple tea with dry biscuits, no grand speeches or toasts to a new life. Everything was said without words. George looked out the window, where dusk was already gathering. You know, Mark, it's interesting, he said suddenly, thoughtfully. What if we could turn everything back? If it all happened again, my call to you back then, from the hospital, would you have acted differently? Mark looked at his father, and answered immediately, without the slightest hesitation. No, Dad, I wouldn't have acted differently. I just wouldn't have let you be alone then. I would have come right away, without a call. Silence fell. Because now I know for sure, Mark continued quietly but firmly, that there's only one thing more painful and terrifying than your own loneliness. Shame. The shame of not being there for someone close when they needed you, when you could have helped, but didn't. George nodded slowly. Quiet wisdom filled his eyes. Then you really have grown up, son. Truly grown up. On the table between them, leaning against the sugar bowl, lay that same old photograph. A young, strong George holding a small, laughing Mark in his arms, and the boy trustingly reaches his tiny hand towards his father. Now everything was reversed. Now the son supported the father, but they were together again, and that was the main miracle of their difficult life.